Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, and I am host of the podcast Life Along the Merrimack. We talk about the health and the history of the Merrimack River. And one thing we're going to do today is talk about the health of the river in the context of a report that came out several years ago, which said that the Merrimack River is one of the most endangered rivers in the country because of pollution and development. The report was done by American Rivers, which is a nonprofit institution in Washington, D.C. And in 2016, it deemed the Merrimack as one of the 10 most endangered rivers in the country. And that's one reason we started this podcast, kind of as to inform people that the Merrimack is somewhat vulnerable, and also as a call to action to talk about what might be done. We have some slides today. This is the Merrimack River. We're going to talk a little about the history, but then we're going to show some slides of the river. It's very beautiful. Parts of it, just pristine and wonderful. And so this is a mix of everything. The three elements that the report said, which, saying that the Merrimack was quite vulnerable, is there's a lot of development upriver. And so we're losing forest and pasture for macadam and houses and shopping malls, much of it in New Hampshire. There's sewage treatment plant issues. In other words, when there's a hard rain, the rain goes into a sewage treatment plant. The plant becomes overwhelmed by both sewage and rain, and the entire amount is deposited into the Merrimack River. This is very bad. And sometimes I remember a time with Mayor Holliday driving around with her. I used to be the reporter for Newburyport, so that's why we were going around in a car, and it was almost brown that day. It had rained for 3 days, and sewage treatment plants in Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill, and Manchester, New Hampshire had all discharged. And there's a big study group working on that. I've talked about that on this podcast, but we want to make sure that people are aware of the vulnerability and learn what they can do about it. This is what the Merrimack looks like in terms of it's coming down from central New Hampshire. It goes through Concord, Manchester, Nashua, and as you can see, and then through the Massachusetts communities of Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill, and then Newburyport is at the Atlantic. And the photo we just saw was Newburyport at the Atlantic, and we'll see another one of those. Newburyport, as we have said, used to be one of the greatest shipbuilding communities on the East Coast. Here is a photo of what older ships look like. This is from about 1855. It was done by a local artist, Richard Burke Jones. And it shows you the majesty, how large the ships were. They're larger than some of the buildings. And thousands of ships were built over a 2-century period in the 18th and 19th centuries. And Newburyport was known as one of the key builders. It had a tremendous trade with other countries. And, many people went to the West Indies, to Hawaii, to China, to India. It was incredible, it really was. Here is an example of a ship that was built at the end of this good period, 1893. It was a Symington. You can see, first of all, how large it is. The people look quite small. And then in the foreground, you can see it was a big event when a ship was built. And women dressed up, kids got out of school. And so this was, a big day for Newburyport when a ship got built. And the major reason why the tall ships ended, at least in Newburyport, was because the ships got very heavy. You can see how heavy this was. And so it got out of the river, which is quite shallow. But when it was loaded with cargo, it could not get back in. So there it was. The ships got large, the cargoes got heavy, the river stayed shallow. And so here we are. But I love this photo, showing in the foreground the many people that came out, and to the left you can see different stages of it. Sharon Spieldenner, who is an archivist at Newburyport Library, which is one of the best archives in Massachusetts, I might add, but if you want to look up your family names, she helped put together some of these slides, and I think they're quite telling. We talk about hydropower. The mills started to be built on the Merrimack River in about 1820, and you needed a falls to catch hydropower. It was one of the big technologies of the day. But even in the 1820s, there were critics, and Henry David Thoreau was one of them. And he basically said, you know, when you dam up these rivers and to make your mills, you're ruining the spawning grounds of the many fish that go up. There were shad, there were salmon, there were striped bass, and it really had a significant environmental effect on the river. As you can see, many mills were put on the Merrimack River. This is the Spigot River, and it hosted enormous mills. That said, it brought many people to the Merrimack Valley for jobs. And I think that's one thing that the American Rivers Group was saying when they said the river is vulnerable, because we still have mills that emit sewage. And the good part about that is that it's a resilient river. It's getting better. Since 1972, when the Clean Water Act was put in, the river has cleaned up very much. In fact, I'm writing a book titled Merrimack, the Resilient River. But this is what things looked like in the late 19th century along the Merrimack River. The mill clock was a central element to people in communities. A lot of mill workers couldn't afford watches, so they would keep time by the large community clocks. And they not only kept time, but they kind of indicated when people would have to get to mill to start their shift. But here is one of the largest clocks in the world. It's supposedly just, you know, a little smaller than Big Ben in London. So it's enormous, it's still there. And as you can see, the mills, in this case, Lawrence, were quite large. In New Hampshire, the Amoskeag manufacturing company was at one time the largest in the world, but bad things can happen to good people. And here's an example of the Amoskeag mills getting flooded in 1936 by the Merrimack River. The 1936 flood, not just here on the Merrimack, but in Maine, in other states, New England states, it did tremendous damage. And you can see just how roaring this river was at this time. And the Amoskeag, as has been stated, was one of the largest in the world. Cotton would come up from the south by rail. Much cotton cloth and woolen and worsted cloth was made here. And so at this period of time, the mills were starting to decline. And of course, when you have a flood like this, it doesn't help. We've talked about it a little bit. This was the harbor through which many of the ships went. The jetties to the top of the photo here were rebuilt in the past 5 or 6 years. The North Jetty and the South Jetty both cost about $10 million each. So $20 million went into the improvement of the harbor. The Corps of Engineers, which supervised it, said they're interested in navigation. And navigation, though, has always been hard. As you can see in the middle, there's a sandbar there. And the literature of Newburyport indicates there's always been a sandbar there, which of course makes it shallower and more difficult for boaters to get in. In the old days, ships would have to wait till high tide. It only draws about 16 feet, which means it has to be, if your ship is heavier and draws more than 16 feet, you've got a problem. And many ship owners and ship captains have waited for the high tide to come in. And this is an example, one of the best that I've seen actually, of the sandbar. And every year, and I'm talking modern times, people who don't know the river will kind of come in along the southern side, which is where the sandbar is. But, the smarter captains and those who radio ahead and to the harbor master say, how am I going to do this? I've never been in the Newburyport Harbor. And he'll say, stay along the North Jetty as much as you can and come at high tide if you possibly can. The Merrimack is a beautiful river, and although we talk about pollution, as we should, it's a fine place to keep a boat. Here are several vessels in Amesbury, and as you can see, there's a lot of rich forest land behind it. This is part of Maudsley State Park, which is really one of the best parks in Massachusetts. It's about 450 acres. If you've been there, you've known there's walking paths. There's areas for horses. There's areas for picnics. In the winter, a lot of people go cross-country skiing there. And it was owned by the Maudsley family for many years. The state got a hold of it in 1985, and I think the community is better for it. And here are some of the vessels on the other side of the river. Again, here's Maudsley State Park, and okay, the river's vulnerable. There's probably pollution right out there, but it's a beautiful spot. And there was a group of legislators and public officials and adventurers that went from last August. They took kayaks down the river from Franklin, New Hampshire to Newburyport. And they said, there's just so much good land along the river. And so that's, I think, why a lot of people want to keep the river clean. And so it can be used for many things. The state officials say you can fish, you can boat. They're a little leery about swimming, I must say. Although upriver in Lawrence, before the mills in Lawrence, there is a swimming beach. And they do calibrate the quality of the water every day. Sometimes it's closed, but there's still some swimming permitted. The National Park Service in Lowell runs vessels along the Merrimack River to talk about the history of the mills. As we said, Lowell was one of the largest mill areas, and it also talks about what can be done to improve it. So here is a bunch of tourists going out. They're getting a lot of information. Lowell started in 1820 and filled up quite fast. And the people who built the mills in Lowell actually created mills and created a community of Lawrence. Lawrence didn't exist till the 1840s. And they said, well, gee, Lowell's doing so well. Let's build some mills in Lawrence. So when they planned Lawrence, they actually planned dorms, they planned recreation areas, they planned parks and schools. Lawrence was created to serve the mills. And Lowell has made a terrific comeback. I can't say that Lawrence's comeback has been quite as robust. If you've been past Lawrence, they have these cavernous mills. Many of them are empty now. And they just haven't been able to get back into good form as Lowell has. Lowell, through the help of Senator Paul Tsongas, the late senator, has a lot of industry in Lowell. Many groups have come to Lowell, have found good education and good living. In fact, many Vietnamese and Laotians have come to Lowell, but Lawrence has not been made quite the good comeback. Here is the Merrimack River. It starts in Franklin, New Hampshire. I have actually been traveling up and down the river. I'm abashed to say by car and foot rather than canoe. But this is a photo I took recently. It's on the Merrimack near Franklin, New Hampshire. And so you can see some white water. You can see that a kayak could be well propelled along this river, but it's really quite beautiful. Now, we started this discussion by saying that the American Rivers Group has said there's, a lot of development going on. And in New Hampshire, it's true. They're building subdivisions in Concord and Nashua. There's more pavement. So rather than having areas where the rainwater and the snow can seep into the earth. It's instead going along pavement or along cul-de-sacs and along with the oil and grime that is put into the river. Now, in my own mind, I think it's very hard to stop, a lot of the development. There are much interest. People want to live in New Hampshire. They want to live in a nice house. So it's true when American rivers say, gee, there's too much development going on in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. This is still a difficult thing to figure out how you can stop development from occurring. But nevertheless, this is, a beautiful shot, I think, of the river, and it indicates what's actually happening upstream. A little farther down in New Hampshire is Manchester, New Hampshire. We did talk about that. Manchester has many beautiful areas, and here's, the natural falls, which has been created over the years to develop hydropower. Now, you can see above the falls, there are utility buildings, and there's a big tower that's going to move electricity, up and down New Hampshire and eventually to Massachusetts. But this is, an enormous river. They've taken the falls and they've taken the hydropower from it. And it's one of the largest falls in New Hampshire. Manchester also had a change, as did Lowell when the mills left, but they've done an awful lot of work to fill the mills. They have universities there in the mills. They have Oracle Software Company is there. Southern New Hampshire University is there, down the river a little bit. And I was amazed that Southern New Hampshire University, which you may have heard of in Manchester, has 5,000 students who come and go on campus, before the virus, that is. But they have 131,000 students who take courses online. That's a large number. It's like Phoenix University, I would think. And we all know that online learning, as a result of the virus, is becoming more prevalent and more in demand. But to think that Southern New Hampshire University has 131,000 students online, what to me was quite impressive. Lowell, as we discussed, has, had a big comeback. There are scores of dams and waterfalls in Lowell. Here's the University of Lowell in the background on the right. This was taken this week, as a matter of fact, but you can see how much building and how much investment in hydropower has taken place over the years. And one thing is sure, when we talked about the voyagers, the kayakers who came down last August, and there were about, I'd say 15 to 18 who did the whole 4-day trip. One of the portages, of course, was in Lowell, and portage being where you have to pick up your kayak or your canoe and walk around. Manchester, as we saw, is a place where you have to do that. But as we look at this piece of Lowell, you can just see there's no way, kayaker could get through that. But I like this photo because it indicates historically how much has gone on in the past to corral the river, and also how the University of Massachusetts Lowell has taken advantage of its riverside location, has thousands of students, and somehow has managed to coexist with the river. A fellow who works for us time to time on our online issues, and we just got Comcast this week, so it was a big thing. But he had a dorm room in the 13th floor. And he's, as I said, naively, gee, there must be a great view from the floor. And so he's about 20. He said, yeah, I can see the river from there. But, to me, this is a remarkable photo of Lawrence, and it might not, of Lowell, and it might not have the view that John has, our tech expert, but, it's certainly an interesting photo. This is also from Lowell. and this is kind of what they call the Canyon Walk. Lowell in recent years, as a result of federal grants, as a result of Paul Tsongas, has really made its history part of the community. And they have a walking area along here, as you can see. And but you could also see how much, how many mills there were, and how much work was done, and how dams and canals were a very big part. And one thing I want to do someday is, I'm intrigued by the history of the mills. I'm also intrigued by the brick business. There were so many bricks created in Lawrence and Lowell and that, up in Manchester and in Maine, where I used to live, in Lewiston and Bedford. There's a tremendous amount of brick building going on. And this was before most of the big machines, and horses brought the bricks, and guys put the bricks together. And so if you go to any of these communities, and I know this because my relatives are from the South, from Memphis, and when they come here and they go on a tour of Lowell, or they see Lawrence, or they say, God, these mills were huge. And they were, and it still amazes people how large they were. And in the case of Lowell, many of them have been repurposed. In the case of Lawrence, that hasn't quite happened. Now, Haverhill is another community on the river, and they've done very well also. They have a University of Massachusetts. Lowell can't branch on right there. Several banks have invested there. And I'll have some pictures of Haverhill coming up soon. But as I say, these communities are working to fill the mills and, give people jobs. And, there's a lot of people who, are trying to make the river cleaner. There are 11 tributaries, by the way, that go into the Merrimack River. And this I was not aware of until recently. Close to 500,000 people still get their drinking water from the Merrimack River. And that includes people in Lowell, Lawrence, Tewksbury, Methuen, and Andover. So in addition to the fact that we want to have clean river for recreational purposes, it's also, important that it stay clean. Because it is drinking water for several 100,000 people. Now, of course, the water is cleaned, and of course it's calibrated. And, but that leads to another interesting story, which was, there was bad drinking water throughout the 19th century. And by 1890, it had gotten really bad. And in Lawrence, a number of youngsters who drank the water died of typhoid fever. And so the state got together, and again, 1890, 1892, and they put a commission for clean water together. And they recruited a number of scientists from MIT to come up to Lawrence. And so they inspected the Lawrence water cleaning efforts. Of course, it was a cleansing process, even if it wasn't too effective. And they were able to say, this isn't working quite right. We have created a new process. And so a new drinking water plant was built in Lawrence. It was tremendously successful. The typhoid fever stopped immediately, as did a lot of intestinal ailments. And so this was a situation where the water was finally addressed. MIT and other scientists came up here and built a solution that was actually copied worldwide. So in addition to having a lot of mills there, having a labor strike, in early times, Lawrence is known as a place that got good drinking water at an early time. And so this is a situation where things are improving. Fish aren't coming back quite yet, but that's a hope. And many people are working to have a cleaner river. And so we did mention Manchester, and here's a much improved version of Manchester. They, as I have said, have been very successful in changing their terrain and their landscape. And this is from the other side of the river, obviously. And but the river's beautiful. The city is looking good, and that's Manchester, New Hampshire. Now, I mentioned earlier that there were some kayakers last year, and here are a few of them. Last August, several dozen went down the Merrimack, all the way from Franklin, New Hampshire, which we have seen, to the mouth in Merrimack, which we have seen. And so this is State Representative Jim Kelcourse in the foreground was among those who came down. And they're going past some whitewater here. And I'm going to have Jim be talking with Jim Kelcourse in a couple of weeks about the river. But here he is. He was quite robust, I must say. He used to play football for Villanova. He's about 6'3" and weighs about 260, which sounds a lot like for a kayak, but he did it very well. And a couple of people who went down with him said, gosh, he's so competitive. He wanted to be the first one to the camp. He wanted to be the first one out in the morning. He wanted to lead the pack. But that's Kelco, lead back. This is Newburyport Harbor, as we know. We just have a couple minutes left, and I have enjoyed this. I will have new slides the next time I tune in, because I do go up the river frequently. This is a wonderful photo of the river, what it looks like today, and how beautiful Newburyport can be. Here's the end of the line. This is fishing. Fishing was a huge business in Newburyport in the 18th and 19th centuries. I think we know it's diminished somewhat because federal regulations, a lack of fish. That is a subject for another Life Along the Merrimack segment. But the river is getting cleaner, and as we say, a lot of people are working to do better. There are about 6 or 8 boats there this summer. Over the years, though, it has been a tremendous element to the community. In fact, it's very dangerous, however, I want to say. In about 1850s, there was something called the Yankee Gale, and hundreds of boats were out on the Atlantic. The gale came up, 92 fishing boats were lost, and 24 of them were for Newburyport. So you can imagine how distraught people were when they heard the rumor, they knew that there had been a terrible storm, and then to find out that 24 boats were gone was a terrible thing. So that's about it for me. This is Life Along the Merrimack. I'm Dyke Hendrickson. We'll be back next week. We talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. And in the future, I'm planning to be talking with Mayor Holliday, Representative Kelcourse, State Senator Diana DeZoglio. So I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much for being part of this. We talk about the health and history of the river. It's a vulnerable river, but it's a good river. So thank you. We'll talk about it again. Bye-bye.